Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. It's a real treat for me, especially since the book came out a little while ago, and a lot has happened since then. Maybe we can talk about that too. But it's funny. So I was born in 1973, right? Apollo was the Apollo program. The last of the Apollo missions was 1972. So I didn't grow up with that. I didn't grow up a space fan. I mean, I liked Star Wars. I like Star Wars a lot, but I wasn't really into Star Trek or any of that, or into NASA and the space program. It just wasn't anything that resonated with me. And in fact, my first memory of space was I was in sixth or seventh grade, I think, and I was homesick from school. And I think just, doing nothing, sitting on the couch watching game shows, and the news broke in with the Space Shuttle Challenger that had exploded. And that was my introduction to space, this tragedy, and watching that over and over again, just on repeat, because the news covered it all day. And of course, it killed all 7 astronauts on board. And that was the resonant moment for me. For it. And so I wasn't paying attention to it, and was actually covering the military, and got assigned in 2014 to cover a press conference at the National Press Club in downtown Washington, D.C., where some guy named Elon Musk was holding a press conference because he was filing a lawsuit against the Pentagon. And I don't think I knew all that much. I mean, I think I knew who Elon was, probably more, through, his dealings with PayPal. I don't think I had known much about SpaceX at all. And I was particularly curious why he would be filing a lawsuit, because as I understood it, the whole lawsuit was intended to have him get and be able to receive Pentagon contracts. And so he wanted the Pentagon as a customer, but here he was suing them. And that didn't seem like a very smart business tactic to me, that you wouldn't want to sue the very agency that you wanted to have as a customer. So I went to the press conference, and the funny thing was, Elon didn't start talking about the lawsuit. He started by giving an update on, it was something I didn't know what he was talking about. It was something about a booster coming back from space and hovering over the water at a precise point, and then splashing into the water. And the more I realized he was talking about reusing boosters and flying them back, as opposed to ditching them in the water. And I kind of remembered that as a takeaway more than the lawsuit. But anyway, I wrote my story and started to do the research about SpaceX and the reusable vehicles and how they were trying to do that. And within a year, he had landed a booster, and I was there for it. Jeff Bezos' company, Blue Origin, had done it on a suborbital vehicle, New Shepard, a month before, and they had gone sort of, tit for tat over Twitter. But seeing, these rockets could be built, and it made me think that this is the beginning of a new chapter in the history of space exploration, in particular of human space exploration, where we had Mercury and Gemini and Apollo and Space Shuttle and Space Station, and now this next era. And made me think that we need to be paying attention to this at the Washington Post, which is my day job. We need to be covering this, which we weren't really doing at the time. And the more I did it, the more I realized that this was a story that transcended what I could do in my day job. It was bigger than the day-to-day work I could do as a newspaper journalist, and thought that there was a book there. And there was, and that was the Space Barons book. But now, so much, as I mentioned earlier, has happened since then. I'm actually working on a sequel to that. So it was a little bit of a risk in that, I decided to move from the military to doing space full time. And there was some, tumult and tension with various bosses and editors, but in the end, it was the right move. And there's so much going on right now that, when I started out, I had to fight. Now I feel like I need an assistant, because there's so much news going on there. But yeah, that's how I decided to cover it, write the book, and now write a sequel. And depending on how things go, can envision this even as something of a trilogy. But let me just pause there, and I'm happy to take any questions you have, or I can just keep rambling on.
Carlos, why don't you ask the first question? Unmute yourself and go ahead.
Sure thing. So in your book, you highlight the competition between Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. In your opinion, how do the differing approaches to space exploration impact the industry? Do you think, like in the fable of turtle versus the hare, the turtle will come on top, or is it different?
No, that's a great question. And that was, so the Space Barons was published in 2018, and kind of the reporting and writing wrapping up in 2017. What we've seen, well, what we saw then and what we've seen particularly since then is very different approaches. And I think what's interesting is the SpaceX approach in a lot of ways takes the Amazon model. What Bezos did for Amazon, and that philosophy was get big fast. And that's what SpaceX has done. I mean, there are many thousands of employees moving from the Falcon 9 rocket, launching satellites, launching cargo to the International Space Station. They won that lawsuit, as you'll probably know, serving the Pentagon, launching astronauts to NASA for the Commercial Crew Program, working on launching the Falcon Heavy rocket, next generation rocket, now working on Starship, which is under contract from NASA to be the lunar lander, the spacecraft that will land the astronauts on the moon, not to mention what they're doing with Starlink and putting up thousands of satellites, more than 3,000 or 3,500 satellites that are in orbit now, more than any other single entity to beam the internet down. So here, the hare has won, and it's not particularly close. And what's gone on at Blue has been a slower, more deliberate pace. And what they're looking at now is obviously their New Glenn rocket, and some other interesting things, though, in regard to what's known as ISRU, in situ resource utilization, that if we're going to go to the moon, we need to stay and have the technologies to stay, to have mining capabilities, to mine water, to turn lunar regolith into building blocks and into sources of power. And they've recently announced a project where they can make solar cells out of the lunar regolith. So I don't by any means count them out. I think the space economy is big for many, many players, but in that particular one, SpaceX is by far the most dominant player in an Amazonian kind of way.
Yeah. Maria, why don't you ask your question about moon bases? That's appropriate at this point. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay,
Yeah.
yes, sorry. So I had a question of, on page 50, this is the online version. Musk expected a base on the moon and trips to Mars. It has not happened yet. Do you think we're going to get there anytime within the next decade?
It's a great question. And I like your time frame, Maria, too, in the next decade, because I think when talking about future technologies and space exploration, we always look like 20, 25 years out. I think 10 years is a much more reasonable time frame. So to have a moon base within a decade, I think that's something of a stretch, but I do think we will have returned to the moon. And what we have now is NASA's Artemis program. And this was a program to return to the moon. It was born under the Trump administration, and it's been carried forward by the Biden administration, which is absolutely really, really significant. We have not had a deep space human exploration campaign survive subsequent presidential administrations since Apollo. right? So you have George W. Bush come in and says, we're going to the moon. And then President Obama comes in and says, no, we've been there, done that. We're going to Mars. We're going to an asteroid. And then Trump comes in and says, no, we're going to the moon. And that doesn't let NASA get any momentum, because you can't build, a deep space exploration program, or even a low Earth orbit one, like a space station program, in just 4 years. It requires a continuity that we just haven't had. Now we have it. And it's interesting that the Biden administration, came in and laid waste to so much of the Trump administration's policies and programs, except for two. And one was Artemis, and one was the Space Force. And those are there, and they do have bipartisan support, and they've got some momentum. So the first launch of the Artemis campaign happened late last year. NASA launched the Orion spacecraft around the moon. They just announced in Houston last week, I was there, the crew of the Artemis 2 mission, which will go around the moon. And then Artemis 3 would land on the moon. When is that going to happen? It's scheduled for 2025. I don't think we're going to hit 25, maybe 26, maybe 27, maybe 28. There are a lot of things that have to happen. The spacesuits need to be ready. SpaceX has to get Starship ready. That's the vehicle that will land on the surface of the moon. But you're beginning to see that infrastructure taking place. And that's what Blue Origin is also working on, not just a lunar lander, a spacecraft that would land on the moon. A lot of people thought actually Blue Origin would have won that contract. But going back to Carlos's question, SpaceX came in and won that as well, and they beat Blue Origin. But now Blue does have their vehicle, and they're working on these other technologies. So you have a lot of momentum that you just haven't had in the past. And the last component is NASA is not just going, and maybe we can talk a little bit about, why they want to build a permanent presence, but it's not just, it's very different than Apollo. They have this large commercial infrastructure, SpaceX, Blue Origin, other companies that are there, but they're also going back with an international consortium, countries that are contributing financial resources and technologies. And in the case of Canada for the Artemis 2 mission, an astronaut who will be part of that. And that sort of shows the international collaboration that we're going, not just as United States, but more broadly, which I think also gives the program a much better chance of succeeding in the long term than we've had in the past.
Wow. Okay, who's next? Come on, guys, girls,
I think I'd ask the next question here.
go ahead.
I kind of wanted to go on the more fun route. And with all of the space tourism and talk about colonization, what do you think will happen when that's possible? Do you think there would be sorts of fun, or do you think fun would be restricted? Like maybe there would be a new type of sport with zero gravity. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be a lot of fun. If we're looking, years, decades, well, even more than that, hundreds of years in the future. Jeff Bezos gave a presentation in 2019 about some of the habitats that he's interested in, not he's interested in creating, but that could be created. And this sort of gets to the scientific future of what it looks like. And even where you could adjust the gravity levels in there and have a regular gravity day or a 0G day, the kinds of floating around. You'll see on the International Space Station, during the World Series, they'll, fool around, playing mock baseball. I think that living in a 0G environment could be extraordinarily fun. We did a story some years ago where we interviewed 50 astronauts. And the premise of the story is, what is it really like to go to space? And the overwhelming answer was, well, as one of the astronauts told me, gravity stinks. It's the worst. It's just awful. Like, the astronauts come back and they're like, oh, how do you deal with all of this? And one of the things I always find funny, and this happens to a lot of astronauts. Like one told me he'd been home for 2 or 3 days back from space, and he's helping his wife unload the groceries, and he's taking the groceries out of the backseat of the car, and he grabs a bag. He says, well, I'm just going to float this here for a minute while I go back and grab the other bag. Of course, it didn't float. It just smashed to the ground, and there went the eggs and the milk, because he was just used to being able to do that. You've got to worry about things flying away, but no, I mean, I think zero G would just be awesome. I think it would be so much fun. The astronauts absolutely love it. Interestingly, one of the things they talked about was how at first you really fumble around. Like it takes some skill to be able to float around. I did a zero G flight, one of those, those airplanes that does the parabolas. And they tell you, like your first couple of parabolas, you're going to flail. Like you're swimming in the water and you just flail, and your arms and your legs, and just don't do that because you may hit somebody. And I was like, all right, I got it. And I've spent a lot of time with astronauts. I'll just float. Like I'm going to be good at this. I flailed like crazy just because it's so disorienting. And it took a few to be able to get it. But no, I think it would be awesome. I think there'd be, you could see like Quidditch coming to life. I mean, you could see all kinds of crazy things. I think it'd be a lot of fun. That's a great question.
Alexis, I saw you had your hand raised a second ago, so why don't you go ahead and ask your question, please?
All right, so this question might be slightly useless after learning that you are working on a sequel and have a trilogy in the works, but my question is, if you could add anything to the Space Barons, like the current book, anything that happened after 2018, what would you add?
No, it's a great question. And it was funny because the book came out, and then 9 months, a year later, the paperback was going to come out, and you have a chance to make additions like that or add an epilogue. And I was talking to my editor about like, well, here I got a Falcon Heavy hadn't flown yet, and we're moving ahead with commercial, like all these things I got to add. And we decided in the end that those things would be outdated within 6 months anyway. And the book ends on an idea. And that idea is that this, sort of race is going to be ongoing for some time, and that, it's leading to the next chapter in human spaceflight and potentially, trying to return to the moon. So, yeah, I mean, there's so much that I wanted to include. I just decided to write a whole other book. And if the first book is, sort of the vision and childhood fantasies that, Bezos and Elon in the early days of SpaceX and Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic and this idea of trying to end government's long-held monopolies on space and moving toward a more commercial regime. And it sort of poses that question. The first book does, can the commercial sector gain a foothold in space, or is this something that governments are going to be doing exclusively forever? And I think the second book, in a way, answers that. And, one of the key themes is human spaceflight, right? If you put a human being on a rocket that's owned and operated by a commercial entity, that's a big deal. We have the Artemis program, surviving subsequent presidential administrations, and we have a broadening now of the space ecosystem beyond just the space barons. Still very much dominated by SpaceX in particular, but other companies are starting to come up, Rocket Lab, perhaps Relativity Space, the idea of habitats, and NASA's changing its paradigm, where it went from, okay, we'll have a public-private partnership and we'll contract out flying cargo and science experiments to the International Space Station. And then that leads to, well, that worked out pretty well. You know what? The space shuttle retired. We'll go ahead and allow the private sector to fly our astronauts, which, that was a really big deal. And that was very, very controversial. And now SpaceX does it, and Boeing, may get flying perhaps this summer, flying astronauts for the first time. Then it became, okay, the commercial sector can build the lunar lander that will land on the moon. okay, we need a replacement to the International Space Station. We'll have a commercial habitat, privately run space stations. So it's interesting to see how that mindset and that way of doing business has completely changed the way NASA is organized, is run, and has changed in some profound and significant ways the way in which we explore, which is really interesting as well. And that, I think, is a very big deal.
Okay, let's see, who's next? What student wants to ask the next question?
I'll go next. So earlier you mentioned that your introduction to and affection for space is very different from others in the space community. Do you think that you would approach your work differently if you had grew up with the same affinity for space?
Well, that's a great question. Yes and no. I mean, it's just funny. It's just one of those life lessons where, I mean, Jeff Bezos likes to say, you don't pick your passions, your passions pick you. And I think a lot of times we think that happens in childhood or young adulthood. And it's funny when something happens later on in life. So I didn't grow up reading all of the science fiction, that a lot of, super, space fans did. To this day, I'm not a huge science fiction fan. There's a few key notable exceptions to that, but there's so for example, I don't know if you guys watch For All Mankind on Apple TV, which I think is one of the most, it's fantastic. It's one of my favorite shows, and I would encourage it. But a lot of my space enthusiast friends love a show called The Expanse, which I just haven't been able to get into for whatever reason. But I also like the fact that for me, coming at it professionally, that it wasn't sort of my childhood hobby, that I think that gives me a little bit of an arm's length independence to look at things, through a journalist's eye, to make sure that there's a heavy dose of skepticism and applying, realism to what's happening and what I cover, as opposed to just being, passionate about it and a fan. So I think that's really important as well. But thanks, Chrissy. That's a great question. I appreciate that.
All right, who's next? Don't be shy, guys. Come on.
But there's a question here from Susan Cotton that I'm happy to handle.
Okay, yeah, go ahead and ask that one.
So the question is that her son was home the day of the Challenger example, but he says that what he saw happen live is different from the replays of the explosion. Do you have a similar memory? And my memory is that no, that was what we saw that day is what it was, that it was, and on the replays, I'll never forget that, sort of why area explosion and how, it was just sort of quiet, how the commentator, the commentator didn't realize what was happening and continued to narrate the launch, and then realized that no, and said, obviously we've had a major malfunction here about it. So that was my memory. But then again, I guess, the news broke in, but, a lot of people were on the ground and watching it that day, including, family of Krista McAuliffe, who was the teacher selected for that mission. So that does seem to track.
Yeah, Christian, I was teaching in the Clear Lake area when that happened, and if I'm not mistaken, we had a couple of the astronauts' kids at our school.
Wow.
Yeah, I remember that day very vividly. Okay, who's next? They're never shy in class, but now they're
I can
shy.
ask the next question.
Go ahead, Mark.
Okay, so I know your book focused mainly on Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, but I was curious to ask if you knew of any other space entrepreneurs from other countries and if they shared similar stories to these characters.
That's an interesting question. So you hear more about a rising space industry in China, in Japan as well. There's a company called iSpace that is weeks away, a couple of months away from having a spacecraft land on the moon. Obviously no people on it. You're starting to see a broadening of the space industry beyond just the US. I think it is, dominated still in the United States. But one of the changes you're seeing, Mark, is we focus a lot on launch in the rockets. But you're seeing a lot of companies get into, manufacturing, 3D printing, space mobility, rovers, that ISRU technology I talked about, and particularly space stations. And that's grown toward, because there's a market for it, in that NASA's awarding contracts and paying companies, a lot of money to do that. So you've got, some of the same players like, Blue Origin, Jeff's company, a company called Axiom Space that is going to launch and have a module on the space station that's based in Houston. Company called Nanoracks, part of Voyager Space, that's working on its habitat. So you are seeing different companies get into it. The other thing that is interesting to me from sort of a business and financial perspective is, if you remember from the beginning of the book, that guy, Andy Beal, who was sort of, case study and what not to do. And there are so many people who are worried about investing for space that, there's that old line, the quickest way to become a millionaire in space is to start out as a billionaire. And it's a great way to lose a lot of money. And the only people invested in space companies were the real sort of passionate people who didn't have, return of investment timelines, 2, 3, 5 years, that they would look 20 years out into the future. And what you've seen more recently is a lot of investment money be pouring into a lot of space startups. Maybe too much, because now as the economy is shrinking and interest rates are rising, you're seeing a lot of these companies go under and the investment money going away. But I thought there was a time where the investment in the space sector was just going, just through the roof. And I think a lot of it was following the space barons. If the richest men in the world this is what they're investing in, then we should get in on that. And there's a little bit of that FOMO, fear of missing out, for sure. Yeah, another great question. These are really good.
Alicia, why don't you ask one of your 2 questions? They're both good ones. Just choose one of those.
Okay, so I'll ask my first question, which is, there's a significant debate surrounding whether people should use the word colonization when referring to these space exploration missions and these basically when talking about space exploration and colonies on the moon or little groups on the moon. And I want to ask you if you believe that word is appropriate to describe the goals of Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. And if you wouldn't use a word, what other term would you use?
Yeah, there's another great question, Alicia. I'm so glad you asked it. If I had, and the language is important. And, I think if I had to do it over again, I'd probably use a word like settlement. And, it's funny too, because you still hear people talk about manned exploration. And that's not a word that we use anymore either. We talk, crewed is a little bit clunky, but sometimes you'll see crewed missions, or just more simply, a human spaceflight or a mission with astronauts on board or people on board, depending on that. So I think that's a great question. I think settlement's a much better word. I think, the colonization, given, the history of that, the repression of native peoples, although as someone pointed out to me, that there aren't, that we know of now or come across any native people in space, but, maybe when we see the aliens, that will change. But I think settlement is probably a better word than colonization for sure.
Do you think robotics, I'm going to take a question real quick for myself. Do you think robotics and the development in robotics is going to undermine putting humans in space? Or is it just inevitable that that's going to occur, that human beings in space?
It depends on the mission. I mean, the surface of Mars, you could see humans eventually going there. And look at the technology we have on Mars and those rovers, yet they're still, they're still pretty slow, and they do not look at a lot of terrain. Now you've got the drones or the helicopter on Mars, Ingenuity, that can cover a lot more territory, but you can see a lot of human machine partnerships. Going to Venus, Mercury, some of these other places are just not fit for human beings to go, and the advancement in the technology, some is fit for robotics, for sure, but there are places where humans can go, and I think that if that is possible, then we'll see more and more humans go.
Carlos, go ahead. I can see you've got another question.
Thank you, Dr. Barr. So there's been a lot of talk about AI, and space we don't really seem like the right thing to go up to space and travel to other solar systems, right? So is the path to evolution separating from our human bodies and somehow getting into a robot and then exploring the universe that way? What are your opinions on that? It's kind of like an out there question.
Yeah, no, I think Elon would do a better job answering that question than me. It's a little bit outside my expertise. But going back to the sort of human machine pairing, you're already seeing some of that in space, and that there are huge, not just technological developments within the spacecraft themselves that are highly autonomous. And that frees up then the astronauts or the passengers to focus on other things, right? If they don't have to worry about flying the spacecraft, they can be worried about the health of the spacecraft. They can be worried about a million different things. And having that computing power in space is tremendously important, particularly if there's a problem with communication with the ground or a lag, and not being able to get that information in a timely way. And we know, that exists if you go to the moon, particularly if you go to Mars, then you're not going to sort of get that real-time communication. So you're seeing things like Amazon has it's like an Alexa-like device that's put on the Orion spacecraft for the astronauts going to the moon. And I think that the more we see AI and the more it's growing and more, things that, these bots and chats can do, people are seeing more and more uses for them. And I think that maybe when it comes to the future in space, it's hard to even know how they'll be used or what questions we should be trying to solve with their use. That it's sort of at the stage where, we don't even know quite how to think about it, except to know that it will probably be significant.
Erica, why don't you ask your second question? It's a good question. Takes us on a little bit of a different path, so to speak.
Okay, so do you think that humanity's pursuit of space could cause us to neglect our own planet? So, what would be the benefits of space? And should humans focus our technological efforts on exploring, preserving, and advancing our own planet before we seek others?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. And it's one that comes up all the time in the space community. Why are you spending all this money going out there when we have real problems here on Earth and existential problems, potentially like climate change. I think the proponents of space exploration would argue that this shouldn't be either or, that it can be and. That we can, solve the climate crisis here, and also look to space exploration. Taking the environment and the climate, as one particular example, you can see areas where, and proponents would point to this, where space exploration has helped with that. For example, the picture of the Earth, the pale blue dot photograph, taken by, I think, Voyager, of Earth hanging in the Milky darkness, vastness of space, and having that perspective that here's the whole Earth, here's the thin line of the atmosphere, here's the blues and greens and land masses without borders. That photograph is in large part responsible for the creation of Earth Day. And if you talk to astronauts who have left the atmosphere and they look back on Earth, they talk a lot about the importance of saving the Earth. And there's an expression called the overview effect. Then you can get into the, Jeff Bezos, this whole idea that in order to save Earth and preserve Earth as this gem, we need to stop, mining Earth resources, excuse me, and using the resources of space to preserve the Earth. But there's always that balance of how much do you invest in space versus investing, here on Earth. Another data point just to think about is that NASA's budget, I think for next year, is something on the order of $28 billion. That's a lot of money. But when you look at, say what the Pentagon gets, which I think is in the order of closer to $800 billion, it's not so big. So a lot of people would say that, the trade-off is worth it. But, that said, that you've got to find a way to balance the two, I think, to be successful.
Christian, if I'm not mistaken, and Erica too, that, just having more accurate satellites has allowed us to track hurricanes a lot better. And certainly here in Houston, that's something, is pretty valuable to be able to do. So, all right, Terry, Pete, Sailor, one of you three ask a question, or we'll go back to Carlos again, who's got about 25 questions.
My question was, how do you think Star Trek and Star Wars and other science fiction influences inspired like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk to create these programs?
I only caught some of the, were you saying how did space?
Yeah, she's asking, how do you think those science fiction series like Star Trek and Star Wars, how did they influence Bezos? Would he have gone to space even if he hadn't been exposed to those things, do you think?
It's another great question. I think it had a huge influence on his life. There's a part in the book I talk about all the science fiction he read while at his grandfather's ranch, that really, I think, framed a lot of his thinking from a young age, and it's something he's carried out his entire life. Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post where I work, and we treat him without fear or favor in the same way we would other people. But Jeff's passion, I always tell people, is I think Blue Origin first, Amazon was second, and then the Washington Post third, and now he's doing other things with the Bezos Earth Fund. But I think that comes from his passion for space, for reading science fiction. And with Elon is, I think the best science fiction is rooted in reality, and that it's not pure fantasy, and that they look at what is possible in the realm of physics. And if it's possible, it can be achieved. And I think what they're wanting to do is push the technology and advance, make a lot of these advancements that we saw in science fiction and make them real, or at least put the building blocks in place so that what they read about as kids will actually one day happen. And so I think that you can't dismiss or undervalue the importance of those early influences on both of them.
Sailor, why don't you ask your question about imagination? This is relevant to what Christian just said.
Okay, so we've been talking about the role and like the theme of imagination in our spaceflight class. And I know you mentioned a more realistic approach to writing your book, but I was just wondering if like, what was the role of imagination in writing The Space Barons, and I guess your sequel as well?
That's a really interesting question. You know, I do think as a journalist, we are very skeptical about a lot of things, but I also think it's important that while we hold people accountable, and particularly, you know, powerful people who wield a lot of influence, if something is working and, you know, has a positive effect, I think there is a value in highlighting that as well, that it's not all about what's wrong, you know, waste, fraud, and abuse, but also here was something that happened that worked. And how did they do that? How did they build a reusable rocket? You know, that's really interesting to look at that and to take a moment and to think, for example, on some of the, you know, earlier questions. You know, there's a lot of, you know, about, oh, should we be going to space? And isn't, you know, the space tourism is for a lot of really rich people, and which it undoubtedly is and has been. But let's just take for a minute and put our, you know, skeptical hat down for a minute and think, imagine, to use that word, imagine if it actually could happen, and that if a lot of people could go to space, and instead of, there are like 550 people have been to space today, somewhere in there, you know, what if that number grew to 5,500 or, you know, a couple decades from now, 55,000 people. And it gets to the point where you know someone, or you know someone who knows someone who's been to space and have seen, you know, the thin line of the atmosphere and the, you know, the darky cosmic beyond and the curvature of the earth and just the brightness and beauty of the earth, and came back with that perspective and wanted to, you know, rededicate themselves to working to make a better planet, then that I think could have a significant impact. So I think it's important, you know, as a writer to use your imagination to look at things in different ways and to challenge yourself and to say, you know, what if I just turn this around and looked at it from a different point of view? What if it's true? Not just what if it's false, but what if it actually could happen? What would that mean? And if that then becomes true, what are the other things that could happen after that? And that kind of intellectual mental exercise, I think, is valuable in journalism and studying and all sorts of things that you might want to do. And it's difficult to force yourself to do that, but I always think it's worth it.
You know, Christian, it's interesting you say that, because we've talked about this in class, in this class, and I've had students in other classes who have read books on the space race or on Apollo, and they have said to me, it's nice to read about something positive, you know, and something that the country did right. You know, I've heard that before, and several students in this class have said that to me. We have one of the students, Jaden, who is doing a research paper in the course on whether we should build a space elevator or not, or look into that research. So, which is along the lines, I suppose, of what you're getting at. So, Pete, are you there? You might want to ask your third question.
Oh, well, my third question was, so which space baron do you think would make the best fictional villain, and why?
Okay. Well, I will say this, since the space barons have come out, you know, particularly Jeff and Elon have gone some different directions with their lives that make them more complicated and nuanced characters, for sure. You know, in some ways, I think Elon is acting out, you know, in real time what you're talking about. We're getting to see the Elon show. Go right ahead, as he says. It's never boring. It's certainly interesting covering him and going into, you know, what he's doing with Twitter. I don't think a lot of people would have saw that coming 5-10 years ago. But you know, there's two, you know, I think a danger of having so much of the space enterprise in so few hands.
Yeah.
That there's a reason why, you know, governments had a monopoly, and that, you know, there's something to be said for a government space agency that takes, you know, the country or countries, if particularly if we're with international allies together as a people, as a humanity, instead of having that all concentrated with one person or one company. And I think diversity is a very important thing. And I realize I'm getting a little bit away from your question, but I had this thought, going back to the previous question about being a positive thing and seeing that diversity and the increased diversity of the astronaut corps. And, Apollo is just a bunch of white men, not just white men, white military pilots for the most part. And now we're going to see the first African-American, the first woman, the first international astronaut go to the moon, which I think is significant and powerful and resonates in a way that could potentially be even greater than Apollo for a lot of people. And that will hopefully, I think, make it more of a sustainable program going forward. If more people can see that this is a program that they could contribute to and they feel connection to, then that's very important.
We've got time for maybe 2 more questions, and I'll ask one right now, and then you all can think about what you would like to ask. One of you can ask it. But Christian, these students are all freshmen or sophomores, and they're thinking about careers and jobs. No one's probably knows as much about the space industry as you. I mean, what jobs do you think are going to be coming open in aerospace over the next decade or over the next 5 years? Where might they look for careers?
I think there are all kinds of opportunities that you're seeing now. 12 years, 15 years ago, your choices were a lot limited. You would do NASA, or you would do one of the big, frankly, Pentagon prime contractors, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, something like that. Now you've got a much broader array of options before you. And I know there is real competition for talent among all of those companies and NASA and JPL. So I think it's a great time to be focused on it. I think it's a great time to be an engineer or STEM focused. I also think it's important for someone who's not an engineer, who was a horrible math student, who focused more on the humanities and history and English and writing, that they also have a role in the aerospace community. And there are a couple of fellowships I'll just mention here if people are interested. There's a fellowship called the Brooke Owens Fellowship that places, I think it's undergrads with jobs in the aerospace industry. The Patty Gray Smith Fellowship, which I think is focused on minority students. The Matthew Isakowitz Fellowship is another one I can think of, and I've had interactions with some of those fellows in terms of being a mentor and participating in Zoom sessions and talking to them. But I think it's important that that they need somebody to be able to tell the story, whether that's in the company or outside. So it doesn't all have to be rocket science. Literally, that there should be an array of disciplines that can help contribute.
Okay, one last question. Who wants to ask it? They're all looking around at each other.
Can I get permission to ask the question?
Sure, go ahead. You've got it.
All right, so I've been thinking about Mars. I realized there's a comparison between Mars and Antarctica, in that both Mars and Antarctica don't have any humans in them. Antarctica doesn't have Antarctica has animals, but Mars doesn't. And they're both incredibly toxic, or not toxic, but dangerous environments. Do you think human settlements that'll be long term, you can make the entire planet able to be livable in? Do you think that'll happen in the next few centuries, or is that just a far shot that it's not going to happen?
Centuries is always a possibility. It sort of gets to that time frame, 10 years out. Centuries, yes, but you're right. I mean, but the air is toxic. I mean, that comparison of Antarctica makes Mars look like a garden paradise is apt. Someone said to me, it's not only like going to Antarctica or the top of Mount Everest, it's like being in Chernobyl at the top of Mount Everest, given the radiation. Another person, laid it out to me this way. Say that the first human landing on Mars finally happens, and it just goes perfectly, as smooth as possible. Like, the journey there, the entry, descent, and landing, and there's that moment where they're on the surface of Mars, and it could not have gone better. It's only then you are still in a crisis mode, right? Because that's how dangerous it is, and that the amount of infrastructure to get there is going to be immense, and people are going to die. And I talked to Elon about it, and he was very upfront in a way that you just don't hear talk about that. Of course, people are going to die going to Mars. People died crossing the Atlantic and the Pacific, and people die on Mount Everest all the time. I mean, you literally, as you're climbing Mount Everest, step over bodies that are entombed there in the snow. And nobody says, well, we shouldn't go back to Mount Everest. But it's a very hard, difficult place in space, not just Mars, but going to the moon. And going to low Earth orbit is incredibly difficult and dangerous. And that shouldn't be forgotten, because I think there is a tendency to romanticize space travel and sort of Hollywood aspects of it, and these beautiful views of Earth, and wow, look at those rockets, are really cool, but it is very, very dangerous and risky, and that you can't overstate that.
Well, that's probably a good note to end on, to remember or remind ourselves of that fact. We want to say thank you, Christian, for taking the time to spend with us today. I hope you found the questions to be interesting ones. And for my class, I will see you in the classroom in about 5 minutes. And for everybody else, I want to say thank you for coming, and thank you, Mr. Davenport.
Yeah, thanks for having me. That was a lot of fun. Really good questions. Really appreciate it. Those were all really good. So thank you.
Best of luck to you.
Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more content from LSC-Kingwood.